Dr. Himender specializes in evolutionary biology, molecular phylogeny, and chemical ecology of ants. He is involved with the global project on ant genomics and is a member of the IUCN Species Survival Commission, South Asian Invertebrate Specialist Group, and the Red Listing of Ant. He has been the president of ANeT since 2009 until now. So everybody welcome Dr. Himender.
Hello. From here, where? Here? So thank you very much again, and the topic is quite interesting, and I have spaced this topic into 3-4 sections. In fact, as we know, to generate data for climate change, we need to work for, say, at least 10 or 20 years. So before that, we cannot conclude anything. But right now, this threat is looming large, and everybody is talking about climate. And then we are thinking in terms of climate, that climate is changing, so what impact it's going to have on biodiversity and other insects and other kind of animals. So what I would like to explain is that what is the current situation regarding ants and other insects, and what we should do for the future. So that kind of strategy, or what we need to do. So as you already know, that over the last, say, 10 years, ants has come up as sort of social organisms which have been labeled as superorganisms. As far as their species number is concerned, we already know the estimated number, sometimes we say 15,000, and sometimes it is estimated around 20,000. So that is the estimated number. And with this kind of approximation or estimation, and already what have been worked out, they have huge impact on ecology. So you already know that their biomass is unparalleled in the tropical rainforest as compared to other insects. And they have, being wide number of species, they have the ability to exploit various kind of niches in ecology, and their social structure is quite interesting. In terms of social organization, not being a myrmecologist, what I feel is that they are unparalleled, or even they have surpassed honeybees in terms of social structure. And as far as their morphology is concerned, that is quite diverse. You find from primitive structures, and then you find quite advanced structures. And in the same species, even you can find different morphs or different phenotypes, and that we call as phenotype plasticity. And they have diverse adaptations. They can adapt to different climate regions, and from Himalaya even we have reported from, say, mountain regions 4,500 meters above mean sea level. And of late, some group of Australians have worked very nicely on ants, and they have been indicated as key indicator organisms, envisaging the type and what kind of climate change or what kind of ecosystem health is deteriorating. In that sense, they are good indicator organisms. But now, as you know, that this era has been named as Anthropocene, because given the activities with human species have done on this planet and what kind of exploitation they have carried. So based on that, we are facing many challenges or many threats. And you already know there is habitat fragmentation, there is usage of pesticide, then we are destroying habitats, then Hashimoto-sen is here, we are dealing with global invasions, and then we are dealing with urbanization, and last not least, on the top of these, we are dealing with climate change. Now, when I was preparing this talk, this month, I think this month, in fact, there was a paper in Nature about decrease in species richness, that was loss of biodiversity at an unprecedented rate. And they thought that this decline in species richness in grasslands, forests, and that was basically for arthropods, but that is an alarming situation for all the insects, and especially for ants, being the social organisms. So you can see the decline in biomass, then you can see the decline in number of individuals. And now what is climate change? In fact, everybody knows now that anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions has contributed to climate change. And it is not about the climate change, it is about the impact. So how it is going to impact? It is going to impact the distributions, it is going to impact the phenology, it is going to impact the ecological communities, and obviously being a network kind of structure or intricate type of ecosystem processes. And now what biodiversity managers, taxonomists, or other claimants of biodiversity, they are working on this and they are trying to monitor this phenomena at a global scale. But what has happened over the time now, that this current pace of anthropogenic warming on climate change, it surpasses all the climate changes which Earth has seen over the last millions of years. Even the Pleistocene glaciations, which we consider during biodiversity or taxonomy studies, that was the major climate shuffle in terms of history of Earth. But this climate change has surpassed all that. And recently, I think last week there was a paper and they said that even if we can keep this pace at 1.5 degrees Celsius in the coming years, and this was in the IPCC report 2018, then there could be some sort of respite. But what are the current situation, that is quite alarming. And you can see this. And this was a paper which appeared in 2000, and now it is 2019. And they have shown on a sort of simulation or projected scale that global temperature is increasing, and at that point of time, they envisage that it could be 0.07 degrees Celsius. And this is the situation for carbon dioxide concentration. Until date, this paper is the most read paper in terms of climate change. And these are some of the projections of biodiversity loss. Now, how it is going to impact, since most of students are also there. So you can see this is a nice network which has shown that how it is going to impact. First, there's going to be carbon dioxide concentration. Then we have abiotic factors which are going to change, increasing global temperature, change in precipitation, then extreme events. So that is a kind of abiotic structure. But how it is going to affect the species? Because in terms of morphology or taxonomy, this is something different altogether. These are going to impact the physiology, the photosynthesis, ultimately the organisms, even ants, their metabolism, and their compositions. Then phenology, that has been recently studied in birds also. Then distribution, there's a lot of hue and cry. They say that the species, the cold species are migrating further up in elevations because the temperature is rising. Then there are adaptations. Then, in fact, everything is intricately connected. So there is going to be changes in the species interactions. And ultimately, this whole scenario is going to change under this background. Now, where do ants stand now? Given this backdrop or background, the situation is that how it is going to impact the ants. So as we know that ants are sensitive to temperature, they are sensitive to humidity fluctuations. Because being social organisms and the kind of survival strategies they have, this is going to impact their survival, their foraging history, and tropical ant fauna is going to be impacted. Similarly, temperate ant fauna is going to be impacted. And as I said earlier, ants are good indicators of ecosystem health. So if composition of ecosystem changes, automatically the effect is going to be manifold. And then there are global invasions, that we have plenty of ants which act as invasive species. So out of 15,000 species, you can say that there are more than 200 species which have been named as non-native, or 19 of these have been labeled as highly problematic. Now, how they impact because they have the super colonial structure. They are polygynous, they have multiple queens, and how they are transferred or how they are distributed globally, that is due to human-mediated activities which promote new introductions. And the other problem is that these introduced species have huge impact on the native ant fauna, and ultimately the ecological function is disturbed. And secondly, there is health hazards also. Then how these ants, their distribution is going to be impacted. They are mostly limited by thermal barriers because they are ectothermic, not endothermic like us. So in that sense, climate change is going to play a major role. As I said earlier, for this kind of study, we need data, say, for 10 or 20 years. But how we can think of it, we have distribution models, we have bioclimatic models on the basis of which simulations are being carried. And based on those simulations, what we are trying to generate is what kind of invasions or what kind of changes are going to happen in near future. So these are the big 5. Out of those 200, these are the big 5 which create a lot of nuisance, create problems for ecosystem. And you can well see in a paper which was published in 2015 that they say the potential distribution of these 5 species is predicted to increase by 35.8%, about 36% by 2080. So this is again based on simulation models. And then recently there was a paper by Benoit on Pachycondyla chinensis, and they also saw that there's a extension of this invasive species. Then ultimately, as I said earlier, there's going to be change in the temperature, and then change in the warming, change in the climate, ultimately climate change, and that is going to have a cascade effect on the ecosystems. And there are other papers also. The first one was published in Robert Dunn's lab. That was, they tried to work out a data of 20 years. Then this was followed by another paper in 16. They worked on climate warming destabilizes forest and communities. Then there are a few more papers which I have listed here. You can see here the first one, then the second one. And the second one is from Australia, 2019. Now, under this scenario and under this backdrop, what we need to do? Where do we stand? What are the gaps? What are the actions? And what are the future recommendations? How do we need to work? So, for such, what actions are to be taken? We generated an action plan in 2003, but somehow it didn't work. So first we need to strengthen the taxonomic part in terms of ants. We need to generate the more taxonomic resources that we need to work what are ants, how they are identified, what is their distribution, and that kind of input we need before we can think of climate change or the impact which climate change is going to have on us. Second, we need to have more stuff on ecology also, because what I have found over the years that taxonomy and other branches of science, they are never interconnected. So taxonomists are separate and other branches are separate. So molecular biology is one aspect, taxonomy is one aspect. So I always say that it should be organismal biology. It should not be molecular biology, or it should not be taxonomy. It should be a sort of integrative approach. So we need to generate all these kind of things and combine together to work on the effectiveness or sort of integrative approach. Now this is another issue. Josh and Drescher just gave me a checklist from Indonesia, and that is a nice work. But to work in Asia, what we need to do is we need to have updated checklists in Asia. That if we have updated checklists in Asia with a proper nomenclature, proper distribution records for each region, each country, then we can think of something on which we can put our stakes or controls. Then we need to work on macro geographical distributions. Then we need to generate identification guides, even for amateurs or for students, so they can think of this. And then we need to generate regional identification tools, maybe in vernacular languages, so that students and others can understand. And then we can have databases, because now you know this is a time of internet, and we need to generate databases which are user-friendly. then we need to identify the important gaps on all these kind of problems. Then we need to have distribution of taxa, that is subfamilies, tribes, genera, species, along biogeographic regions, countries, and most importantly, which is still lacking in Asia, is networking among taxonomists. Because until or unless we exchange our notes, we do not know what the right hand is doing and what the left hand is doing. So for that, we need to have a proper network, and ANeT has been successful in that aspect. And secondly, we need to identify those areas which are poorly known, because there are still very, you can say, regions or areas which are still poorly studied or poorly known. And then we need to generate more taxonomic resources. Now, in terms of climate change, we need to think in terms of ecological perspective also. That is, we need to classify the communities, we need to know the distribution of ants, and we need to think in terms of environmental gradients which affect community diversity and composition. We need to study the distributional patterns, and we need to think of those ecosystems which are fragile, which are weak, and which are threatened. And we need to think of those regions which are high in endemism, which are high in species richness, and lastly, which are threatened by anthropogenic activities. And you can say to diversify it, we need to because mostly for ants, we think they are nuisance until or unless we are myrmecologists. So we need to think of those ant groups or species which are threatened. Their ecology, or you can say distribution, is still poorly known, and sometimes they are threats also. What kind of impact they are going to have on ecosystems, and then we can work, or we can use them as indicators, that how they reflect ecosystem health, and which species functional groups are reliable indicators. Earlier, there was a functional group scheme which was proposed by Anderson and Major, but now that is no more used, and we are coming up with a different sort of functional group schemes. And then we need to know what kind of highly restricted species, their distributions, what is their current status. Then we need to work on comparative studies of impact of invasive species, then investigate ecology of abundant or conspicuous ants, and ants which are threat, we need to work about their presence, frequency, abundance. And finally, there is another area which is coming up nicely, especially in India and other parts of the world, that is chemical ecology. That is, we can think of cuticular hydrocarbons. Cuticular hydrocarbons, they play a major role in social structure of ants, so we can think of them and we can work on that, how those cuticular hydrocarbons integrate the social structure, and how this kind of behavior or colonial structure is going to be impacted by changes in climate. Then this is another interesting aspect which is entirely lacking in most of the studies. As I said earlier also, taxonomy is no more morphotaxonomy now. It should have some integrative approach. So this is a kind of approach which I generally tell my students also, and nowadays we should think in terms of evolution. That is eco-evolutionary dynamics. That if climate change is there, what kind of impact natural selection is going to play. Because mostly organisms, when they are threatened by some activities, they face strong selection pressures. And obviously there is a change in evolutionary trajectory of their traits. So we need to think in terms of evolution, in terms of ecology, and we need to integrate all that kind of stuff. And last week I read a paper that was urban evolution, and they said fast-paced natural selection in order to adapt to warmer climate. So that means organisms who are surviving or adapting to urban environment or warmer climate, what they are doing, they have some kind of mechanisms in terms of evolution by which they can adapt to this kind of change. Then we need to think in terms of what kind of this climate change is going to put on genomic architecture in terms of genome, genes, what kind of changes are there. Because you already know it is the gene which determines the phenotype, which determines the structure. We need to think in terms of that. So this was another paper, and Hashimoto might have seen this, what ant can teach us about the effects of climate change, and then this, at the bottom in scientific reports by Suzy, controlling invasive ants, a theoretical strategy for efficient monitoring in the early stages of invasion. Then thank you very much, and I would like to acknowledge Dr. Decha, Faculty of Forestry, John, who is not here, Carsten, who is not here. We have been designing this action plan for many years, but unfortunately, it didn't mature. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have some time for the questions. So anybody have questions to the keynote speakers? Okay, there.
Climate change. But I don't really see much about the conservation of ant diversity itself. Like, is there any, like a particular species of ants that are threatened under climate change or any types of anthropogenic disturbance? Is there any progress in that kind of field of science?
No, that is, as I said in the lecture, the most threatened fauna is basically the temperate fauna, which is in the mountain region. Say, if the range is, say, 1,000 meters to 3,000 meters, and what we feel is that if there is a change in temperature or climate and they are adapted to high altitude regions, so either they are going to shift to the higher elevations or there's going to be extinction or that kind of change, because you can say their gene pool is not so flexible as compared to the invasive species. So that is the major problem. And the second issue is that to understand this kind of impact, which we daily think in terms of climate change, we need at least 10 years to work on this kind of change. So that is the major thing. And